Rope bit into my chest as I sat pinned to the rough tree. A rifle levelled just beyond sight, while Kito braced between me and the danger, muscles trembling in hard savanna light. His training said to attack the gunman, but he stared at the knots instead, every breath a choice that could cost us both. Beneath the fear was the heavy sense of a second chance I had never really earned. To understand why he stood there defying every rule, we have to go back to the quiet nights at the outpost before anything seemed wrong. The night the generator coughed and the compound lights flickered. I sat alone on the porch, boots on warm wood, listening to the dry grass hiss in the wind. The radio crackled from the duty room, a distant voice mentioning fresh tire tracks by the north boundary. Beside the door, Kito's metal kennel rattled as he turned, restless, toenails ticking like warning taps. I told myself it was just another long shift in a place that spooked newcomers. Crickets droned. A spotted thick knee wailed somewhere out in the brush, and the sky burned down to embers along the horizon. My phone buzzed with a text from the chief about a community meeting tomorrow. In the dim light, Kito's silhouette rose, pressed against the kennel door, staring past me into the dark. When I got up to check his water, he shoved his nose hard through the bars, chest heaving, then swung his head back toward the tree line as if pointing. Easy, boy, I murmured, hand on the latch, feeling that familiar pull between protocol and gut. A thorn branch scraped the corrugated fence at the back of the yard. Sudden and sharp. I flinched before I could laugh at myself. Out beyond the compound, a truck engine shifted gears on the distant dirt road, then faded. Someone slammed a door at the bunkhouse, laughter spilling out, and the smell of wood smoke drifted on the air. I reminded myself this was just northern Namibia, not my old beat back in Ohio. Still, every time the wind changed, Kito's hackles rose, and something inside me rose with them. I finally unclipped the kennel and let him out. He didn't sprint or stretch like he usually did. He moved slow, deliberate, placing himself between me and the open yard. A thorn twig snapped near the outer fence. He froze, nose high, body tight. Nothing there, I said. Yet my hand drifted toward the radio on my belt, thumb finding the call button without thinking. The duty ranger, Simeon, stepped out of the office, paperwork in hand, and called across, asking if he'd seen the updated patrol grid. His voice felt too loud in the soft dark. Kito swung his head towards Simeon, but kept his body angled toward the tree line. I joked that my dog was turning paranoid. Simeon just shrugged and mentioned rumors of new poachers working the corridor. When the generator finally steadied and the compound lights brightened, some of the tension bled from my shoulders. I told myself I was reading too much into a jumpy dog and a few strange sounds. Still, when I went inside, I found Kito's leash already dragged halfway to the door, as if Head nosed it there on purpose. For a moment I just stared, feeling watched by my own doubt. I tried to sleep, but the mattress felt like a thin excuse between me and the night. Somewhere between midnight and the first hint of dawn, a single sharp bark snapped me upright. Then silence. No follow-up bark. No footsteps. Just the ticking of the ceiling fan. I lay there listening, knowing that in this place, silence after a warning was never really quiet. Morning came with hard light and the smell of dust and coffee. At roll call by the Land Rovers, the chief spread a map on the hood and pointed to a series of hoof prints near the river. New cattle, new grazing permit. Nothing unusual. Still, he asked me to keep Kito close during the community meeting after lunch. The request lodged in my mind like a small stone. On the training field, I set up our usual scent trail, dragging a burlap sack along the fence line. Kito should have followed it, nose to the ground. Instead, halfway through, he broke from the track and trotted to the northern fence, nose pressed to the mesh. Beyond, the savanna rolled out in pale gold waves. He whined low, tail straight, eyes fixed on a stand of acacias. I gave the correction command, firm and practiced. He obeyed, circling back, but his body stayed taut, ears swiveling back to that same gap in the trees. A gust of wind carried the faint smell of exhaust, old and oily. An unseen vehicle shifted gears out there. I told myself it was a tourist truck on the main road. Kito's lips peeled back in a silent, puzzled snarl. Just before lunch, a ranger from another outpost arrived with a crumpled flyer from town. 3 men in grainy photos, wanted for kidnapping a local farmer weeks back over grazing rights and rhino rumours. The flyer fluttered on the notice board, corners lifting in the breeze. As we studied the faces, Kito lay at my heel, quietly vibrating, eyes never leaving the doorway to the yard. During the community meeting in the shaded courtyard, children chased each other around the plastic chairs, while elders spoke about water pumps and cattle. Kito lay under my chair, head on his paws. When a dusty white pickup eased past the gate, he rose, pushing his shoulders between my knees, staring after it. The driver never looked in, but the back window carried an unfamiliar sticker. That night, I checked the perimeter with Simeon, our flashlights sweeping low over the sand. Twice, we found scuffed patches near the north fence that didn't match any of our patrol boots. Fresh cigarette butts glowed faintly under the beam. I radioed it in. The chief chalked it up to herders cutting through. As we walked back, Kito kept glancing at me as if asking why we were turning away. Lying in bed, I watched the ceiling fan spin shadows over the cracked plaster. Kito slept by the door, not in his usual corner, chin resting on the threshold as if counting footsteps. I thought of the flyers' faces, the strange pickup, the scuffed sand. It's nothing you can't handle, I told myself, trying to sound like my old sergeant. The words felt borrowed and thin. When the wind picked up around midnight, it carried distant thunder and the faint echo of a truck door slamming far beyond the fence line. Kito stood, listening, then padded over and placed his paw gently on the side of my bed, claws clicking once on the frame. In that moment, the simple, high-contrast truth settled in. If trouble came here, he would choose me over every rule it drilled into him. Before Namibia, there was Ohio, with grey winters that clung to the sidewalks and red brick houses lined up like they'd been there forever. Bo rode in the back of my cruiser, breath fogging the windows, a steady weight behind my shoulder on every call. Our town was small enough that folks waved at us by name, but big enough that the radio still spat out trouble after dark. Little storms that never made the news. One January evening, the snow turned to slick glass, and the dispatcher's voice came over thin and tight, sending us to a house at the edge of town. Porch light swinging, one bulb out, shouting muffled through the door. Bo sat at my heel on the icy steps, nails scraping as he tried to hold his balance, eyes locked on the noise inside. Protocol said wait for backup, but the shouting broke into a sharp, scared sound that made waiting feel like betrayal. The memory still comes in fragments. The smell of cheap beer and something burned. A woman's tear-streaked face near the kitchen. A man's shadow moving fast in the hallway. Bo pressed forward when the door slammed somewhere deeper in the house, my hand tightening on his harness while I called out my presence in a calm voice that didn't match my pulse. A half second of hesitation, a wrong turn toward the louder noise, then a flash and a ringing crack that seemed to hollow out the air. They told me later I did everything I could, that the angle was bad, that accidents happen in chaos. All those careful words meant to patch over a hole. What I remember is Bo on the kitchen tile, breath coming short, eyes still searching for my face as if waiting for the next command. The way his paw twitched once when I said his name, the way the world narrowed to the rise and fall of his chest and the cold sting of snow blowing in under the back door. Grief counselling came with clipboards and soft voices. The department's way of proving it cared, but it couldn't touch the quiet moments. His harness hung in my locker, empty, the leather still carrying the shape of his shoulders. I drove the cruiser alone, hand grazing the spot where his head used to rest. On my days off, I parked by the training field and watched other teams run drills, leaving the engine idling so I could pretend it only stopped there by chance. One spring morning, A stack of union flyers slid across the break room table, and something glossy fell out and landed face up near my coffee. The pamphlet showed a dawn sky over thorn trees, silhouettes of rangers and lean dogs leaping from dusty trucks, a caption about protecting wildlife and communities. I told myself I was just curious, nothing more, as I slipped it into my pocket instead of the trash and carried it back to my locker. For weeks I pretended not to see it, though it kept resurfacing in my hands whenever I opened the metal door. The email address at the bottom looked like it belonged to another life, one where people still believed I should handle a dog again. I sat on the bench in the locker room one night with the pamphlet open on my knees, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Boz, old leash, coiled beside me like a quiet accusation that was also an invitation. When I finally hit send on the application, it felt less like a bold move and more like stepping onto ice without knowing its thickness. The interview calls blurred together. Talk of tracking and community relations and long nights in open country. Months later, the plane touched down on a runway edged with red dirt and flat light, and the air tasted different, drier, older, threaded with dust and wood smoke instead of exhaust and snow. The outpost felt small compared to a Midwestern station, more plywood and tin than brick and concrete, but it had its own kind of sturdiness. Kennels lined one wall of the yard, metal doors ringing as dogs barked and whined. When they brought me to Kito's run, he wasn't calm or measured like Bo had been. He launched at the bars with both paws, not out of malice, but with a vibrating need to work, to latch on to something that made sense to him. Our first tracking drill together was messy and too fast. I laid the scent line, heart thudding with old ghosts, and released him. Kito surged ahead, overshot the curve, then skidded and circled back, chest heaving, nose cutting diligent patterns through the dust until he found the decoy. Instead of barking and holding like the book said, he looked back at me first, eyes asking if he should commit. In that tiny hesitation, I saw all the ways Id failed Bo. And right there on that hot, bright field, I promised this dog I would never ignore what he was trying to tell me, even if it didn't fit neatly into the rules. The week before, everything came to a head. The heat settled over the reserve like a heavy blanket and stayed there. By mid-morning, our shirts stuck to our backs, and even the horses flicked their ears more slowly beneath the sun. One Tuesday, Simeon waved me over to the north fence, his boot drawing a line in the trampled grass where the wire sagged just enough to tempt someone with bad intentions. Dew still clung to the disturbed blades, darkening the sand in a narrow path. Kito paced alongside us, nose sweeping low, his usual curiosity sharper than on routine patrols. Halfway down the sagging section he froze, inhaled deeply, and all the lines of his body changed. His fur bristled from neck to tail, and he followed an invisible thread off the obvious trail to a patch where someone had knelt, knees leaving faint ovals in the dust. A half-crushed cigarette butt lay there, still carrying the stale, oily smell of cheap tobacco that didn't belong to any of our crew. We took pictures, measured distances, marked coordinates in the little spiral notebook I kept in my pocket. The chief listened over the radio, voice steady but tighter than usual, then told us to patch the fence and add an extra sweep that night. "We don't want to stir up panic," he said, meaning among both rangers and neighbours. As we talked, a delivery truck rumbled into the yard with sacks of feed, backfiring once. Kito flinched, then immediately turned back toward the tree line, unwilling to let the distraction pull him away. That afternoon, a storm banked on the horizon, clouds piling up like distant mountains. But the air around the compound stayed stubbornly still. In the small office, the satellite phone rang with news from a neighbouring reserve. Gunshots heard near their border 2 nights earlier. No carcasses found yet. I sat at the metal desk, filling out an incident report, pen hesitating at the box that asked whether I believed there was an immediate threat. My hand hovered a long time over no before sliding to unsure, a word that tasted like failure. During evening training, I tried to burn off Kito's surplus energy with a more demanding drill. Simeon volunteered to play the fleeing suspect, jogging down the field in a padded sleeve as the sun slid lower. At the release cue, Kito launched straight and fast, dust spraying behind him, then did something he'd never seen from him before. Halfway to Simeon, he skidded, pivoted, and ran back toward me, planting himself between my knees and the darkening tree line instead of between my voice and the decoys retreating back. Simeon jogged back, panting and laughing at first, thinking Kito had simply become confused. But when he saw the dog's posture ears pinned toward the bush, muscles quivering, gaze fixed past us, his smile faded. We stood there for a moment, the 3 of us in a crooked triangle, listening to the quiet beyond the fence. Nothing moved, but the stillness had an edge to it, like the seconds between lightning and thunder when you're not sure how close the storm really is. Later, the chief gathered us under the open-sided shelter by the horse corral, oil lamps swaying and beetles ticking against the glass. He spoke about recent poaching attempts, about men willing to make examples of anyone who got in their way, about whispered stories of kidnappings tied to conservation work. "We are guests here," he reminded us, meaning we had to balance firmness with respect. As he talked, a hyena whooped out in the dark, and Kito inched closer to my leg, eyes roaming toward the sound and then back again. When I turned in that night, I noticed my door was resting just off the latch instead of firmly shut. Inside, nothing looked obviously disturbed. My bunk was neatly made, boots lined up, gear stacked where Id left it. But the lock on my metal locker hung crooked. The metal around it scraped in a way it hadn't been that morning. On the small table, the recruiting pamphlet from Ohio lay open to the photo of rangers walking with their dogs at dawn, a page I hadn't touched in months. Someone had taken the time to look at my past. I radioed the chief, keeping my voice level as I described the lock and the pamphlet. He sighed, suggested a bored junior ranger might have been nosing around for snacks or cigarettes, promised to ask quietly. The explanation slipped over the surface of my unease without touching it. As I talked, Kito moved slowly from the doorway to the table, sniffing the edges, then sneezed, lips wrinkling at a scent I couldn't name. When I hung up, he walked to the corner where his leash hung and bumped it with his nose until it swung back and forth. A small, insistent metronome that said, "Be ready." By the end of the week, we had patched the fence and logged extra patrols. The official steps taken and filed. The sky stayed clear despite the storm that kept threatening, and daily chores went on. Feeding horses, checking water points, greeting community visitors. Yet each night, as the compound settled and the generator hummed into its steady rhythm, Kito chose the same spot by my door instead of his usual corner. If I shifted in my sleep, he lifted his head, tags chiming softly. And for all my years of training, I still found myself hoping he was wrong, even as I knew he usually wasn't. The morning it all broke open. The air felt oddly still, the kind of hush that makes you speak more quietly without knowing why. The sun hadn't fully cleared the horizon when the chief called an early briefing. Maps spread on the hood of the oldest Land Rover. Reports of shots near the river. A dead snare line found by community scouts. Tracks crossing where they shouldn't. His finger dragged along a faded contour toward an old cattle post north of the boundary and stopped there like a pin. We rolled out with 2 rangers standing in the back, rifles resting between their knees, silhouettes sharp against the brightening sky. Old Land Rover rattled over washboard ruts and shallow gullies, its familiar complaints almost comforting. Kito braced in the rear compartment, nose jammed into the narrow opening that let the outside world in, chest rising and falling in quick bursts. As we left the usual patrol loop and took a lesser used track, he began to whine softly, pushing against the slats as if he could shift the truck by will alone. At the waypoint, the engine clicked into silence, and the savanna's own sounds flowed back in. Insects buzzing, a distant bird calling, our boots crunching on sun-baked sand. Tire marks crisscrossed the ground, some belonging to us, others fresher and slightly wider, angling toward the abandoned cattle post. A spent cartridge lay half hidden under a scrubby bush. Metal still faintly warm when I picked it up. I clipped Kito's line to his collar, gave the tracking cue, and felt him take in the scent with a deep, deliberate pull. He started forward, following the obvious line for several strides, then slowed, muscles tightening under my hand. His head lifted, nose sweeping, and he turned slightly away from the tracks, toward a thin stand of acacias that didn't match the map or our plan. He looked back at me, eyes sharp with that question he'd learned to respect, then tugged once in that new direction. Behind us, the rangers adjusted their rifles and shifted their feet, waiting for me to decide whether we followed the vehicle trail or the dog. I never got to answer. A shout in a language I only half understood snapped across the clearing, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle that spat dust near my boot. Someone swore. Another voice yelled from the trees, and the careful lines of the morning dissolved into chaos. The Land Rover lurched as our driver tried to slam it into gear. Rough hands grabbed at my vest from behind. A blow to my ribs knocked the air out of me, and Kito's bark turned from focused to furious as he lunged against the line. In the scramble that followed, the world shrank to fragments again. A burlap sack coming down over my head, the smell of old grain and sweat inside the rough weave, my wrists yanked behind me and cinched with rope that bit into skin. I felt myself dragged across gravel, boots scraping, shoulders screaming as they pulled me upright against something unyielding and textured. When they ripped the sack away, the light hit me so hard I had to close my eyes for a heartbeat before I could see the tree. Ambush tree loomed above me, bark biting into my back as they wrapped rope around my chest and the trunk, each pull tightening until breath became something I had to work for. 3 men moved in and out of my field of vision, faces half shadowed by hats and angles. One smoked, flicking ash carelessly into the sand. Another scrolled on a phone, signal dropping and returning. His frustration obviously more about reception than about the man they'd just pinned to a tree. I heard them mention messages and foreigners. The words flat and businesslike. Somewhere beyond the scraggly bushes came a low growl that cut through my rising panic like a familiar song. Kito. Alive. The sound was deeper than I'd ever heard from him, full of something dark and steady. One of the men turned toward it, lifting his rifle in that direction with casual menace, moving into the brush to investigate. My tongue pressed against my teeth with the urge to call Kito back, to say his name, to give any command at all. But anything I said might give away his position. I swallowed the impulse and pressed the back of my head into the bark instead. The remaining 2 kept glancing toward where their companion had vanished, irritation sharpening their movements. They hadn't bothered tying my legs, counting on rope, fear, and distance to do their work. Sweat ran down my spine, soaking my shirt where it met rough bark. a fly traced the line of one rope burn on my wrist, and I jerked away as far as I could. In the shifting grass at the edge of my vision, a shape flickered, Kito's eyes catching the light for just a second before he melted back into cover, weighing options like a chess player looking 3 moves ahead. Back at the compound, unseen to me, our driverless Land Rover rolled into the yard with unnerving calm, engine still idling. Simeon clung to the side, dust-streaked and wide-eyed, shouting as the truck lurched to a stop. Old Land Rover's rear compartment sat open, the crate empty, Kito's absence louder than any bark. The chief ran out, hand on his radio, questions overlapping as other rangers gathered. When Simeon pointed north with a shaking arm instead of answering, the chief's face hardened into the kind of resolve he'd only seen once or twice before. Under the tree, time stretched thin and strange, each minute marked by the creak of rope as my chest rose and fell. The 2 men left argued in short bursts, phone calls dropping as they moved around the pickup, nerves starting to fray at the edges. One checked the horizon more often now, as if the empty line between earth and sky might suddenly sprout consequence. The sun crawled higher, turning the bark at my back from warm to something close to burning. A rustle in the brush to my left pulled one man's gaze. He muttered, moving toward it, rifle low. The other stayed closer to me, boredom and threat tangled in his posture. That was when Kito stepped out from the opposite side, as quiet as shadow. He placed himself between me and the armed man, body low but steady, ears angled forward, eyes burning with a focus he'd only seen on training fields, never in the wild heart of a real, unscripted danger. Every part of his training said that a direct threat to his handler meant going for the weapon hand, driving it away from the body, biting and holding until backup arrived. Instead, when I whispered the only word I dared stay, he trembled, a visible shiver running from his shoulders to his tail, and held position. The man with the rifle let out a short laugh, testing, taking 1 step closer. Kito's lips peeled back in a low, warning rumble that started somewhere under his ribs and vibrated through the dust at my knees. The other man shouted from the brush that he'd seen tracks leading toward the road, voice tight with the first hint of worry. In that sliver of distraction, Kito shifted his weight and did something no manual could have prepared him for. Instead of launching at the man, he darted toward my side, jaws closing on the thick rope where it wrapped my hip to the trunk. His teeth sawed once, twice, fibers snapping under the pressure. Then he sprang away again as the rifle swung toward him like a club. The blow caught him a glancing hit along the ear, a sharp sound of wood on bone that made my stomach lurch. Kito yelped, a strangled sound more of surprise than surrender. then regained his footing a few paces away. A dark line blossomed along the edge of one ear, but he never took his eyes off me and the rope. Twice more, as the men argued over their poor phone signal and whether to move me, he darted in to shred more strands, retreating each time before the rifle could land a solid hit. Each snapped fibre widened the space between my ribs and the tree. Back at the compound, Kito's sudden appearance at the north edge of the yard turned heads. He came in low and fast, fur caked with dust, tongue lolling, eyes wild with a purpose nobody had trained into him. Instead of heading for water or shade, he ran straight to the nearest Land Rover, claws scraping metal as he tried to climb into the back on his own. When the chief called his name, Kito swung around and barked in a harsh, staccato rhythm, then wheeled and bolted back toward the gate, glancing over his shoulder to make sure we understood. The search party came together faster than any drill we'd ever run. Rangers grabbed rifles and medkits, boots thudding on concrete. The community elder arrived with 2 younger men and their battered pickup, saying only that they knew some of the old paths better than the trucks did. Radios crackled. Coordinates flew. The momentary chaos settling into a focused urgency with Kito as its centre. He jumped into the lead vehicle the second the door opened, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the northern horizon as if he could already see the tree and the ropes and the choice head made. Under ambush tree, shadows shortened as noon crept closer. The men finally decided they'd wasted enough time waiting and that whatever message they meant to send could be delivered without moving me farther. One stepped forward, knife in hand, ready to cut the rope from the trunk and haul me toward the thicker brush. As he reached for the knot near my chest, Kito exploded from behind the tree, not at the arm, but at the remaining rope, tearing into it with a savage precision that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with understanding what truly held me. The sudden slack sent me pitching forward, colliding with the man's legs and knocking him off balance. We hit the ground in a tangle of dust and limbs, the knife skittering away into the grass. The second man swung the rifle, firing a panicked shot into the air rather than risk hitting his partner. The crack rang out across the clearing, echoing off nothing and everything. Kito darted between us and the muzzle, planting himself over my chest, body arched, teeth bared, his whole frame a trembling shield that refused to yield an inch. Even before I heard the engines, I felt the change in the air, a low vibration under the sand, a new direction to the dust on the horizon. Old Land Rover burst into view first, brakes squealing as it slid to a stop. The chief and Simeon already halfway out of the cab before the wheels fully locked. Another truck and the community pickup fanned out behind, doors flying open as boots hit the ground. From where I lay, half freed and fully spent, the scene imprinted itself in a way I knew would never fade. Rangers leveled rifles with a professionalism honed by too many threats and too few resources. Voices stayed low, but firm. Commands, in 2 languages, weaving into something that brooked no argument. The man with the rifle hesitated, eyes darting between the circle of barrels and the dog standing over me. Kito didn't move, didn't look back, didn't need another cue. He simply stared down the danger with a stillness that said he would not be moved. Not from this spot, not from this job, not again. When the gun finally clattered to the ground, something tight in my chest loosened enough to let air in without pain. Later, in the courtyard, as the sun slid low and the adrenaline thinned, the chief told the story again for those who hadn't seen it with their own eyes. The radio reporter held up a phone to catch his words. Children pressed against their parents' sides. Elders watching with faces carved deep by both loss and endurance. He spoke of a dog who ran home alone to fetch help, then chose to break his training, not to attack, but to free his handler instead. Listening to him, rope burns still stinging under clean bandages, I realized that what Kito had remembered in that clearing wasn't just a trail or a routine. He remembered what it meant to trust me even when I no longer fully trusted myself. In the days after the rescue, the savanna looked exactly the same from the porch. But standing there with my shoulder aching and my chest wrapped in gauze, it felt different. Mornings began with the familiar clatter of buckets and the smell of coffee. Yet there was a new softness in the way people said my name, a carefulness that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with shared relief. Kito stayed closer than ever, his shadow overlapping mine whenever I crossed the yard. The compound doctor checked my bandages in a cramped room that smelled of antiseptic and dust. Her hands efficient but gentle. She texted at the rope burns, muttering about infection and sun exposure, while Kito lay under the exam table with his head resting on my boot, eyes tracking every movement. When she lifted the edge of the gauze on his nicked ear, he held still without a sound, only glancing up at me once as if to confirm that this small pain was part of the bargain we'd both accepted. An investigator from the capital arrived a few days later. Crisp shirt, no match for the heat. Notebook already half full. We sat under the shelter near the horse corral while he asked careful questions about procedures and decisions, about how we handled tips and patrol patterns. When he wondered aloud why Kito's crate hadn't kept him inside the Land Rover, I heard myself say that sometimes, when a dog who has never broken a command runs, the smartest thing you can do is follow him. The investigator blinked, then wrote that down word for word. The little ceremony they organized wasn't grand, but it reached further than any official commendation he'd ever seen. Community members came in their best shirts and dresses, children clutching hand-painted signs with Kito's name spelled however their hands knew how. The chief held up a framed certificate from the conservation agency. Words about bravery and service printed in neat lines. My fingers shook when I knelt to fasten the new brass tag on Kito's collar, the tiny plate catching the late afternoon light like a promise made in metal. Patrols resumed with tighter protocols and more radios checked twice. But something subtler changed alongside the paperwork. When Kito paused now at the fence line or stared a little too long at a passing vehicle, nobody rolled their eyes or hurried him along. Younger rangers watched his posture, the way his ears tilted and his tail stiffened, and started adjusting their own routes to match his quiet concerns. The dog who had once been seen as just another tool became, in small, everyday ways, a colleague whose opinion carried weight. At night the nightmares still came, though less sharply with each passing week. He'd jolt awake with the feeling of bark digging into my back and rope cutting across my ribs, heart galloping. In that first disoriented moment, before memory sorted itself out, I would hear Kitos breathing by the door and feel the rough boards of the floor under my bare feet instead of sand. When I swung my legs over the side of the bed, he rose without a word, padded over, and rested his head on my knee until my pulse remembered we were home. On the next community day, we held a gathering not for danger but for learning. Under the big acacia in the village centre, we set up a ring of chairs and invited families to come meet the doghood raced across the bush to bring me back. I showed the children where to touch him and where to leave him space, taught them to read the difference between a wag of greeting and the stillness of focus. Kito tolerated sticky fingers in his fur with patience, occasionally leaning into a small shoulder as if to steady both of them at once. As the sun slipped behind the hills, painting the sky in soft oranges and violets, the chief spoke about the work ahead. He announced that from then on, trained K9S would be listed on the emergency response roster alongside human names. No longer just equipment, but partners on paper as they already were in reality. People murmured their approval, some clapping softly. Standing there with Kito pressed against my leg, I felt the rhythm of my days shift into something sturdier, a pattern built not just on duty, but on a shared understanding that none of us stood watch alone anymore. Months later, the tree where they'd tied me still stood, bark scarred where the rope had bitten deep. On a quiet Sunday, Simeon drove me out there with a thermos of coffee and a small metal tagwed had engraved with the date. Kito jumped down from the truck, trotted straight to the trunk, and sniffed the ground, then looked back at me as if to check we were both really here. Free. We fastened the tag low on the rough bark. Not a monument, just a marker. The savanna around us swayed in the mild breeze, unimpressed by human ceremonies. A herd of springbok flickered past in the distance, all white flashes and effortless grace. Kito lay at my feet, tongue lolling, eyes half closed, as if finally satisfied that the tree no longer held any claim on us. Back at the compound, the daily rhythms had settled into something gentler, Generators still coughed. Radios still crackled. Trucks still came and went in clouds of dust. But there was more laughter in the pauses. New handlers arrived to train. Some from small American towns like mine. They listened closely when I spoke about Beau, about mistakes, about a Malinois who had chosen differently when it mattered. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a tin mug of tea, watching the sky bruise into purple and gold. Kito stretched out along the boards, one paw always just touching my boot, as if to keep some quiet promise alive. When the wind shifted and carried sounds from the village drums, distant radios, occasional bursts of song, I felt less like a visitor and more like part of something woven together by shared danger and grace. One night, as the first stars blinked awake and Kito sighed in his sleep, chasing some dream track only he could smell, I reached down and rested my hand on his neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the fur. You found me when I was tied to more than a tree. I whispered into the warm dark. His ear twitched, as if head heard. I'm glad we found each other. I'm not alone anymore. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.